Okay, so today is lecture 21, and the topic is reproducible research computing. And you know this is a personal emphasis area of mine. I've been talking about this in pieces throughout this whole course. That was one of the main motivations for doing GIT. We had some readings about best practices at the beginning of the semester that alluded to these topics, but today's readings from assignment 10, which was due last Wednesday, are all about this mission and this drive and this movement, rather, for reproducible research computing. And we've had speakers come in for seminar in chemical engineering who've talked about the crisis of reproducibility on the experimental side as well, and the general theory side. So things like thermodynamic properties that might be measured by multiple labs and they're not the same values, or some classic calculated information, there are differences if you use different techniques. And so trying to be reproducible, but also cognizant of some differences between different methods or different experimental equipment. We want to try to standardize those things. And so there's definitely a need to make sure that and many of you, when you learned a scientific method, learned that as you write a report, you should put in there enough that someone else could replicate your exact study and hopefully get your same results, right? So that you could prove that it wasn't just a finding that was due to some values you happened to calculate that particular day, but was really fundamental about the problem you were exploring and about the technique that you had used that someone else in a different lab with the same equipment could get the same values. And so on the computational side, what's been happening, computational techniques have been growing in popularity since about the 40s, but there were certainly numerical and mathematical techniques way before that. That on the computational side, people would say, well, here's my tool, and I want to get money for this tool, so I'm not going to publish the background details, but they have maybe a benchmark that they might compare to. So those things about validation and verification that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that was sort of the gold standard. Could you prove that your results matched some validation data, or that you verified some limiting case that it had the right kind of error that you were predicting? And if so, that was good enough. But then they found that, well, okay, you put all this investment, this time in these particular projects, and when that grad student graduates, that's gone. Or you might sell it to a company, and then it might be very expensive to reuse or modify that code. And so there were things where there's a lot of legacy codes that are really bulky and that you don't know all the details of, or there are ways that it's really challenging to reproduce scientific computing results. And so there's really not excuses. It's more of what's been the norm of very proprietary science. And so in the last decade, I would say there's been a call for reproducible research computing. And from a lab perspective, where I'm often interested in taking the state of the art and moving that boundary of knowledge, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if there's already a code that does this, and we need to add lots of bells and whistles to it, we don't want to start from nothing and try to spend a lot of time reproducing that before we can go on. But I've been told by other labs, oh, well, that code's from 10 years ago. I don't have that anymore. Like, okay, great. Or we have this code, but you can only use it on our website. You can't see the back end. You can't add anything new to it. You can't extend it. Like, well, great. Okay, so it basically means all your stuff is trash. Like, we can see what you've published, but we're trying to reproduce it, and we're seeing that you have some inconsistencies in the way you named things and versus the way you listed your parameters, and they don't match up one-to-one, and there's just a lot of gaps where reviewers may not have gone into that level of detail, but someone trying to reproduce it goes into that level of detail. And so there's been a lot of challenges in that regard that my students are very much proselytized to be on board with reproducible research computing based on a lot of experiences having challenges in reproducing the work of others. So what I want to do today is I'm going to leave some time toward the end for questions about computational assignment 6. But what I want to start with is the discussion of reading assignment 10. And it's not all of the reading, because some of it is what we'll talk about next Monday. So parts of the reading were about the optional parts were about Markdown and some tools for nice scientific visualization in MATLAB and Python. So we'll talk about those next week. Export Fig, if you get to that part in your computational assignment, that's what we'll talk about next Monday. And then there was also some part of the reading about open source software projects. We'll talk about that the following Wednesday. But so these are the reading sections about reproducible research computing. And there's 5 of them that I've listed here, and a couple of them are from the optional, and I recognize that most people don't read the optional materials, and I know that some of you forgot to turn in the assignment the day it's due, so you may not have read the actual original readings. So what I'd like to do is to pair up, or triple could be fine, make sure at least one person in the group did turn in a reading assignment 10, so that you have their reading to go from. But I'm going to give each one of your groups one of the readings, and we're going to do Jigsaw. And so Jigsaw is a pedagogical technique where different groups are assigned to provide the content. And so one group, for example, might be assigned the first one of these, and we'll spend about 5 minutes. You'll go back through, you'll skim it, or look back at your reading assignment notes, and then you'll report back to the whole class about what were the key points from number 1. Another group will do number 2, likewise, throughout all 5 of these readings. And so instead of me just lecturing about what were key points in these 5 readings, you are providing the content from your readings and what your interpretations were. But because other people may have read the first 3 of these, there may be some feedback from the group. All right? So that's what we'll do. So with this number of people, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, and 12. All right, so we can have 5 groups so that each group can just have one of these assignments. You'll spend about 5 or so minutes reading through it, or reading back through your notes on it. The optional ones are fairly short, or at least have some nice headings. You don't have to read it in detail, but you can highlight those bullet points of what their main, the best practices one, so it has itemized numbered lists. And report back about what are these key points of these readings so that the rest of the group can discuss those. All right, so so groups. Form your groups. What are my 5 groups? It might make a, all right. Yes. So Caitlin, you're going with Philip? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then Harani, you going to the 4th lab over there? Okay. Okay, so great. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Who wants number 1? All right, you guys get to be reading 10.1. Number 1. Who wants number 2? Okay, they got it in the back. Reading 10.2. Do you want number 3 then? Okay, you'll read 10.4. Who wants the 4th one? All right, Philip, you guys got optional reading 10.2. Do you guys have optional reading 10.3 on the best practices? All right, so we'll take about 5 minutes. If you're feeling like you need more time at the end of that, let me know. So that'll be 8:15. And I'll have you guys come up here and talk about it and report out, okay? And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. The teammates don't want to join? You're just sitting all up here by yourself?
We discussed it.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna do this file preview a little bit, maybe. Do you need to point to anything in the document, or?
Actually, I just go through
Okay.
summary. So.
Okay, great. So this is reading 1.
The article discussed the issue and the chronology and what's the definition of reusable and applicable research in order to find a common ground, in order to find to understand which kind of research we are talking about. So basically, there are three terms, which is reproducible, and applicable, and repeatable, and each group would define it differently. And one example that was given here, I think, reputational, was that it was shown in the end of the article, and it says, for example, repeatable. Same result, same method, same team, applicable, same method, different team, and same results, and reproducible, same method, same result, different team, and different. So this is basically the idea behind this article. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Were there questions or other discussion that people had about this particular one from your reading summary or any questions you had. So there are those definitions that Carla was mentioning about the reproducible, replication, and somewhere in there about repeatability.
What kind of reviewing the literature and which team would define those three terms?
Yeah.
And here, what they were subdivided to two groups, and then the A and B. One A would distinguish between among them. B wouldn't. A wouldn't distinguish between them. B would do. And within B groups, there are subdivision. Each one would define it differently.
Okay, that's a really good point for science, that you may be using a term that might even be a hot term, but you need to make sure that you articulate how you intend for that to be used in your document. So an example of that I encountered recently was structure-property relationships, and so I had structure-function relationships. I had heard that in the context of material science and molecular dynamics of being a way to use these molecular atomistic calculations to know something about like thermodynamic properties or bulk material properties, and to come up with sort of correlations about the bulk from those atomistic molecular scale. So that's what I interpreted that to be, and that's the way it's often used in chemical engineering. I went to a kidney nephrology conference where they're often taking cross-sections of human tissue, and they get the anatomical structure, but they want to know what the physiological function of tubes that are certain diameters or certain areas that are very fibrous, what all of that does. And so they talked about understanding the relationship between these anatomical slices and the physiological function as being structure-function relationships. Like, oh, you're not doing molecular dynamics in here, and you're not, it is a very different paradigm, but they were calling it the same terminology. I had never searched for that terminology on that application because to me, that terminology was something else. It was reserved for a different type of procedure, but in fact, I do this other thing. That's exactly what I'm doing. So in this context, I had never searched for those keywords because of this bias on what I thought that definition meant. So sometimes the definitions are adopted by different communities, much like in the reproducible, repeatable, replicable, and so to be careful that you know what those mean. And also we had that conversation with validation and verification, that I don't think it means what you think it means, thing from The Princess Bride. I don't know how many of you have seen that classic movie from the 80s. If you have not, you should. It's a really great piece of American cinema. Amazing movie. But there's a guy who keeps saying certain terms that inconceivable, and they finally say, I don't think it means what you think it means. It's overused, and so you might also, with right now people talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and throwing that around all the time, not everyone knows what it means, and they just think it's something glamorous, and it must be anything computational advanced, must be machine learning, and must be artificial intelligence, when in fact, it may not be. It could be computational fluid dynamics or DFT calculations or something else that is innovative and not necessarily artificial intelligence. Anyway, that's personal soapbox. All right, so reading number 2, which was, or the second discussion point, which is from reading 10.2. Who's coming up? All right, Brian.
So this one's kind of interesting in the sense that it takes the weight off the researchers in a way. So the basis of this reading was the fact that groups from 3 different areas, so funding agencies, journal editors, and also researchers got together to discuss what reproducibility should mean and what everyone's role in that should be. And so one of the big ones, of course, for the scientists is just kind of what we know is to share our code and to use open source software that I don't have to pay money for and that I don't have to ask people to pay money for, and things of that nature, and to provide those parameters and such. And then stuff like the journal editors provide kind of a standard of how do I provide that information. So instead of I might share my code one way using one type of software like Bitbucket, or not software, but one kind of outlet like Bitbucket, and that might not be how someone else does it, and so to kind of create that standard. And then also with the funding agencies, the kind of weight falls on them to have a standard of what steps you should take to reproduce and to have a team of people that would reproduce that kind of data to make sure that your research is in fact reproducible. And so one of the big ideas about this is that, so I use a software called Octopus for my calculations. And I've been handed stuff that's from a different version. And so that might be okay, as you might say, well, you can just update to a new version, update the input file and stuff like that. And that sounds easy. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes some of the functionality that was with the version originally is now obsolete. They blur that out. And so reproducibility in that sense, providing the versions and all of that is really important.
Other questions or discussion about this particular article from what you read for the assignment? Was that one just one page, Brian? Oh no, okay, I can chat. I tabbed through there. It's just one reader. So yeah, a lot of roundtable. And so a lot of these things were, people were talking about it, but they said we need to actually get some stakeholders involved and know what it means to different groups and the different angles and perspectives on this. And certainly among scientists to know what does it mean for reproducibility in types of work like molecular dynamics, what Philip works on, where processes inherently are stochastic. So can you reproduce this if you are having all these randomized things that happen? How do you make sure that that's the same over many runs? Could you get the exact same run to happen again versus something in computational fluid dynamics or electromagnetics, all kinds of different application areas? What are the questions and concerns for those fields? Yeah.
That's kind of interesting because so one of the articles that I was reading from my research, they use a random number generator for some of their parameters, and so they actually provided the code and supplemental part of their of the published article. They provided the content info file for that random number generator to get that exact layout.
Yeah, so random number generators in MATLAB and Python in particular, and other codes, they go through lots and lots of numbers, but they go through those numbers in a repeatable fashion, starting from what's called a seed. And so if you know what that starting seed number is, it might be 35 or 0.2 or something random and arbitrary. But from that number, they have a sequence of how they manipulate and get and it's maybe thousands of numbers before they repeat, but they have a certain sequence that they go through, an algorithm to do that. And so if you did start with the same seed, then you could start with the same ordering of those random numbers. So yeah, that's great. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah, so excellent sort of summary of what this kind of team put together. So third group, which was those guys. Okay, so reading 10.4.
All right, so this article was basically a review article of techniques used for computational reproducibility, and it goes through a beginning bit on why you need to have reproducibility, and then some new developments in the field, like some journals are apparently starting to require that if you print in the journal, you include your code in an open source format as a supplemental information file. And then it also notes ways to publish that allow your research to be reproducible, such as while a narrative description of what your code should do is really helpful, it doesn't do much if you don't actually have the code there as well. And like you were saying, how older versions of software will sometimes do things. This one talks about some interesting components for packaging research. So GUIs, you just have the user interface you manipulate. There are also these things called virtual machines that package your entire hard drive on your computer at the time of creation and send that. So you download a mirror image and you're running everything exactly the way they were running it. So if you have software inconsistencies, that just eliminates that possibility. And that was really cool. I didn't know those existed. I don't know. And then it just talks about some other methods of packaging your research in your code to make it easier for others to view.
They also reiterate that your code has to be readable, so not only can you provide a narrative, you need to write your code
one of our projects that Carly's working on is trying to rapidly reproduce other people's work, and it's worked okay for getting the equations in. But one of the papers, they tried to be very general in their description of a model. So they have something like, I don't know, 10 species. So they call them all A, A1, A2, A3, etc. And then they had a bunch of rate constants, which they just called K1, K2, etc. And so their equations all look like A times K1 plus A2 times K2, and a bunch of interactions for this really complex network that is not just 1 and 2 interacting and 2 and 3 interacting, but this jumble of things. And so when you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, which one of these is protein that I care about? Which one of these is the cell membrane? Which one of these is insulin? And because if you're going to compare to any other paper, those are all measured for specific species that are known in the literature or specific species that are measured. And so while it was a good generic framework, it is really hard to figure out the physical interpretation of this particular model when we're looking at it, or to look at the series of rate constants, and we're trying to compare it to another model, which everything was very physical. And so it's like having to go back and like, okay, A1 is this, and you have to like look at the table of nomenclature back and forth a lot. And so that just makes the timing of the reuse part much more challenging. It's there, it's accurate, but there's just a lot of mental conversion that has to happen because it's not very readable in the way that they did. It's clear on what they did, but then it's just a lot of translation part. So these visualizations, the team pointed out that they're kind of generic. They are just colorful, but they are a little bit demonstrating, they are demonstrating that idea of what kind of these virtual machines might look like, where everything gets encapsulated so that you can do the whole project again without having to, I as a person may not remember to know, okay, I was doing this on a Windows 10 operating system and I had this service pack update and all of those nuances, but they all play a role in how my entire workflow happens. So if I'm documenting what my entire workflow is, then, or I know what my pieces are and I let this virtual machine encapsulate all of that, then I can just give people that without having to necessarily itemize everything. Okay, so the next one was an optional reading. Philip and Caitlin, Reproducible Research, Computational Science.
So this one was fairly brief, but it kind of posits the same thing that most of the other readings have done so far, which is the idea of a validation database or some functionality within journals to validate the code that you submit. So one thing that this article points out is that there's kind of this scale of reproducibility, what's good, what's bad, anywhere from publication-only code, which is something Dr. Forbes mentioned earlier, all the way to having fully replicatable code, fully reproducible code, and all your executables and data that you use to do your research submitted either to the journal or in some open source repository. One thing that this author points out is that the primary issue facing this sort of idea is a culture shift, which is necessary, which is essentially it's hard to get people to change the way they've always been doing things. So they make a couple suggestions and a couple steps that they should do. One, that everyone doing research should publish their code in the form that they actually do the research in, whether that's properly commented and pretty and everything or not. Second, after that, they should take time to clean up the code and post it again. And third, this author also advocates for an implementation of a national database for code system errors.
Are there questions or comments about this one? I know many of you didn't check out the optional reading, so, and in particular, I really like this figure, so that's one of the main reasons it was in here, so. Oops. And they even made the gold standard yellow so that it was very clear. That's cool. Any questions or comments about that? So this article is very short, but it's in Science. It's more of a commentary. Last but not least, best practices. Jake and Osama?
Yeah, so this article talks about the best practices and principles for computing software. And there are some rules or principles, as I said. So the very first one is that when authors publish anything in coding, they basically need to include the code, the software, and the algorithms, and the data that is used. Now, if the data is too large, such as if we have a very large data set, instead of putting it in the publication, we can provide it in other means, like online, for example, rather than just putting a whole large data set in the publication. And another principle is that whenever we're using software and data and publishing it, it needs to be open sourced so that the readers should easily read and then use this data later on if they want it. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, so also super important is you want people to be able to grab the exact piece of code that you were working with. And citing where you got your data from, so if you didn't create your own data, you need to tell people where they came from.
These were the general 4 to 5 principles.
Yeah, they have a number of different bullet points too. Yeah, kind of, it's lots of best practices.
It mainly talked about the version controls, and maybe 3 of them.
One other piece that they talk about in this one is about citing not just your data, but if you get code from something else, how to make sure to cite and attribute sort of sources of your code that you built upon. And so, and if you want people to be able to cite your code, giving people ways to do that. So maybe having a DOI number, which there are ways to link your GitHub or Bitbucket to something called Zenodo that gives you a free digital object identifier so that then your figures or your code can be easily citable with a DOI number, much like you would a publication, so that there's this permanent snapshot that's always online that makes it easy for people to cite and reuse rather than just like, oh, I got this file from Jake and that's how I'm citing it, personal communication. It's actually somewhere that other people can find it and permanently interact with. I've also found recently that sometimes people say, oh, it's on our website or it's on the website of our software distributor, and then that software distributor gets bought out by another company and the page is broken. I'm like, so your entire thing was check out our model on our website. There's not actually in the supplemental information for this paper, and it's not in the paper, and then the website goes away. So then it's like, this is trash. I can't prove that this even worked 5 years ago. So you want those permanent. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all for playing. That was the jigsaw where you all become the subject matter experts in different pieces, and together we put the puzzle together when you're all sharing the information that you've gathered. I do want to point out that last December, there was a special issue of the Bulletin of Mathematical Biology that focused on reproducibility. And I didn't assign these readings, but I just want to point them out. So there's an editorial about reproducibility in scientific research, which is just a page or two long, about the need. And then secondly, here, the second link is the actual table of contents for this issue. So the editorial that I just mentioned, Crisis of Reproducibility, the Denominator Problem, and the Scientific Role of Multiscale Modeling. And I actually met this guy at a conference at the NIH this fall. Reproducible research using biomodels, problems with current approach to dissemination of computational science and implications for research integrity, reproducible research in mathematical sciences, a change in our peer review culture, and modernization of our current publication approach. So this guy was the president of the Society of Mathematical Biology that year. His term is now ended, but the idea of during peer review that there is a mechanism for incentivizing reviewers to check that your code is documented, and how do we actually peer review that when it's hard enough to peer review the articles. And then the rest of this is just the regular scientific communications for this particular issue of the journal, so they're not related to the special issue. But several here that if you're interested in this topic, there are these resources. It's definitely part of a modern discussion. I went to this conference at NIH in the fall, in October, and there was a lot of questions about this. And they said, we don't have any incentive to publish our software. And I stood up at the microphone and said, do you know about the Journal of Open Source Software? And they all said, no. What is that? So it's a whole journal about publishing your software, having someone peer review just the software, and you basically have a publication out of just the software. And it's a very low barrier for scientists that we have our code, we put it open source on Bitbucket or GitHub or something like that. You write a paragraph saying the importance of your code, but then the actual part that's getting peer reviewed is the code and your documentation on the code website. It's not, you don't have to write this other separate paper. You just have the paragraph that introduces the importance of your code, and then they just review your code. But then it's a peer-reviewed manuscript that you get, that you can list on your publications, that is basically giving you credit for having done a good job about your software, and that it was reproducible, readable, all of those good things. So we have 3 publications now in that journal. I don't put every project there because sometimes our stuff is a little bit less readable, but I do publish our code, or I just put our code out there when we submit a journal paper. But the ones that I think I want others to reuse very easily and that we've done a good job documenting, then we'll put in the journal open source software and have that peer review process. So after that, I got several people who were from NIH who do a lot of stuff with modeling and reproducible stuff going, oh, I didn't know about this journal yet, and talking to me about it. And I'm like, well, I'm not the proprietor of this journal. I just happen to use it and think it's fantastic. But there's a lot of people who are still discovering tools and trying to think about what are these best practices. And so it's very, very open dialogue, open time. As you as a scientist are going to be at this forefront of that culture shift of wanting and calling for open things. People a bit older than me were very much trying to say, can we patent our code? Can we try to get money out of our code? And I think that I'm not going to come up with the next Comsol or the next Fluent or something like that, where there are these massive companies that have acquired a lot of codes that are major heavyweight types of software platforms. I might be able to add something incremental to them, but it's not going to be worth millions of dollars as a whole company. So I'm very much on the front of let's make the science reproducible. It's great for the funding agencies. They're very much wanting things that the federal government pays for to be open to the population in the US, but also scientists and researchers around the world. And so there's definitely a lot of positive feedback on that from proposals and such. So anyway, these are just if you're interested in more topics. And I wanted to just briefly go through some of this. So Professor Barba Lorena Barba is a professor at, I believe, George Washington University, and she is the first person I saw publicly presenting on reproducible research computing. I went to a AAAS conference. This is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This is the group that puts out the journal Science. And they have an annual conference, and it happened to be in Boston while I was a postdoc. So that's the reason I went. But it was really cool about public science communication and really cool speakers. And so she talked, and I thought, oh, I'm hooked. I buy into everything she's saying. And so I've been following her work for a number of years. She was an author on one of the definitions paper that the first group talked about. And so she has a number of different things from her classes that she's put on GitHub. And this one's kind of a larger workshop where they talk about a number of different topics, including what is Python, what is version control, a lot of the topics from this class that we've spent a lot of time on. So I won't go through all of that, but she's called this class a hands-on workshop, 4 days, about essential skills. All right, so those essential skills being how do you use the command line? If you wanted more background on that, you could use that. What is Python? What is GitHub? Some things with push and pull. And GitHub being exactly like Bitbucket, just all open. We are using Bitbucket so that you can have private repositories, but you could make them public if you wanted to. And you could do exactly the same things we've done on Bitbucket on GitHub. She also talks about Jupyter Notebooks. She's a really big fan of Jupyter Notebooks. And then she also does a lot with PDEs, so there's some computational fluid dynamics examples. The piece I wanted to point out to you today is the section on software licensing that she has. And so it talks about some of the different licensing models, and that if you're going to put code out there, there's different ways that you can get acknowledged for that. And I went to a workshop at the library last week that was about open educational resources. And so in the United States, if you write some words and you put them on a piece of paper, or you get them out of your head and into some readable form, that is then, you have the copyright to that, if it is your original material. You don't have to file for copyright, you have copyright over your original creative ideas. Written word, or voice recordings, or videos, all of that stuff, that's your creative content. If you die and it's been 70 or 90 years after you die, it becomes in the public domain. So things like the happy birthday song, you do not have to get permission to reuse the happy birthday song, or some other children's song tune. So many things that nursery rhymes or lullabies, these types of things are probably very much older. They're now in the common public domain. So the copyright has expired because the original creator no longer needs to get licensing or royalties from that. But things in between, where full copyright, where you own it, you're the only one who can manipulate that content and reuse it, to everyone in the world can reuse it with no attribution, that's the public domain. So in between that is the spectrum of creative license. So you can choose to keep your work in your own copyright, that no one else has permission to reuse it. But when you try to submit something to a journal, they're going to ask you to sign a copyright release form. It may be that you can still reuse it for educational purposes, or put it in your dissertation, or might be able to retain that to put on your website, something like that. Or they may say, we want full copyright. Everything is now ours, the publisher. So you have to decide if those agreements are what you want. For our codes, if we want others to be able to reuse them, we can choose different licenses that allow them to completely reuse, or to only reuse with our permission, or to reuse if they give us attribution, or we may say you're not allowed to change this, or you may specify that it cannot be used for commercial purposes if you want it to maintain this open spirit. So there's a number of different licenses that allow people to have some spectrum between completely open, I don't care, do whatever you want, I never need to see anything again, or it's mine, don't touch it. Right, so there's a whole range of stuff in between, and all these different licenses give people the privilege of having some variation. So there's a whole category of things. Creative Commons is the most popular for written work or for visual media. So you'll see a lot of stuff on Wikipedia, for example, has Creative Commons licenses. This is more on what are the common software licenses. So BSD and MIT are two very common licenses. So there's this idea of permissive and copyleft. So if copyright is over here, copyleft is on the other extreme. So this idea that I want you to be able to use my stuff and continue to copy it, but probably with some attribution to me. Proprietary is that I'm going to sell it to a company and you can't see it and you can't use it. So that's a different paradigm. So they have different combinations of what they allow. But this could say that if you took one of these, then people who use it after you could choose to use it for proprietary purposes or continue to use it in the same manner. Some of them require that everyone after you uses it in exactly the same manner. So that's what this copyleft is indicating. And then if it's proprietary, you may not be able to reuse it afterwards because it's owned by someone else and you don't have the privileges for that. So there's a number of different licenses. What I typically do is look at what other people are doing in a similar space. So most of our stuff is licensed in exactly the same way that Lorena Barba has licensed her software in her lab. So this BSD 3-clause license is very common. So MIT, the above copyright notice and this permission shall be included in all copyright or in all copies or substantial portions of the software. So that's all it says. You just got to have this notice. That's what the MIT license requires. The BSD 3 clause says you must have the copyright notice, any conditions, and a disclaimer. And so we tend to use one of those two. If we're doing pictures or images or presentations, that's our material, has to be our work. We can't choose to relicense other people's work because I don't have the copyright to change other people's work. But if I'm reusing something that was Creative Commons, or I am putting my stuff out there in the Creative Commons, the generic one is to say, this is open, but you need to reference me. So that's Creative Commons by attribution. So you'll see CC-BY and like 4.0, CC by. So Creative Commons license by attribution to the original source. Others may say some combination of how you can distribute it more constricted. So anyway, that's just a little overview of that. There's some great information online too about, like, for example, GitHub. GitHub wants you to be able to license your repository, and so they've got a really great section of stuff about what are the licenses and how do you choose. And it lets you think about, well, what do I want to happen with this software, and what are the intended audiences and the intended purpose, and helps you make that decision in a very informed way, rather than, oh, I just picked what somebody else did when they may have had a different user group in mind. And so this is a really excellent resource. But again, I came to that from GitHub. And so that gives you example licenses. And so I tend to do this one because it's short and it lets anybody do what they want to, but they should attribute us. So as a researcher, I want people to be able to reuse my stuff, but I want some credit for having made it in the first place. So can they cite my original source, give me some credit, but then do what they want to afterwards? Because if they use it and adapt it in other ways, that's extending the reach of my science. I can't possibly do everything with it in my entire lifetime, but if other people use it and do new things with it, then that's enhancing the impact of my science. If people knew that it started from my science, right? So those are the kind of goals that I have for my reproducible work. Okay, so that's a couple of tools I wanted you to be aware of, that there are resources for looking at and investigating licenses. Again, if you wanted more information about the Creative Commons licenses, there's a whole series of things online about that. Also, where you can choose which one you're interested in and what best suits your purposes, particularly on written words or presentations or images, that kind of thing. So they have the different legal pieces and the different icons that you might want for that. Right. So, big topic. Part of that culture shift for me is to inform you all as the next generation of scientists and engineers that this is a topic that I hope that you find near and dear to your own hearts, and that you would then try to promote in your own research, knowing that you have to be sensitive to your entire team, that if there are drivers on your team that are with contracts that then require certain things stay closed, or they stay closed until a patent is issued or something like that, that you're sensitive to that you don't just go rogue and make everything open if that's not what is within the contract that you're working under. But I hope that you would be a proponent for being as open as you can in the time frame in which you can be. So in our own practices, we keep our repositories private until we submit the journal article. Then we move that same code to a public GitHub repository, so then it can be public from then on. But we know that as we're developing it, there's bugs in it. It's not ready yet for consumption. And so we're okay with people knowing what our process is, but when it's half done and it doesn't really do the things we promised for it to do, we don't think it's really ready for others to see. So that's why we have that particular workflow for ourselves. Other comments or questions on this topic? Has anybody been doing open reproducible research computing as they publish or as they interact with other software or things in their labs?
Kind of like, I started working on it, it's a PDC package developed on Python by Purdue University, and it's open source, it's available on GitHub, and anyone can put it, install it in Python and can use it for different types of compressor models.
Okay, awesome. And you talked about Octopus being open, right? I definitely think it helps when you find software that's really well done, that is open, that you can then use and build from.
It allows you to focus on the science. I think that's one good.
Yeah, that's a huge,
We're not gonna rush.
yeah, I mean, that you can really, exactly as you said, so a reason that we look at tech is so that you can focus on the content rather than the word processing. And if you can remove that layer of burden, then you can get more done and can actually think about, all right, let's move the science forward rather than moving the software infrastructure forward or moving the formatting forward. You have something aspects that are important on that side, but you want to be able to, you generally chose to study engineering or science or mathematics because you cared about problem solving and that you want to go after those problems. A computer science version of this class, though, would be about let's make new infrastructure, right? But as a scientist and engineer, you're the ones that want to be able to solve the problems, and that infrastructure needs to be able to support your problem solving. So if that's not there, sometimes we're developing those tools and communicating with maybe computer scientists or others to make those resources more reusable and more friendly for scientists. So